The land debate, a sensitive matter. Who owns it and who should administer it? Comments on the issue and many questions still unanswered. But it's the comment from former President Kgalema Motlanthe that has hit a nerve. Motlanthe called traditional leaders dictators who feel they're entitled to the land, a rhetoric that did not sit well with traditional leaders.
We are therefore calling upon the ANC to distance themselves from that comment of Kgalema Motlanthe or come out clean about it, because he is a leader in the ANC. If anyone gives such a comment, you might think he's speaking on behalf of some other people. Traditional leaders who have been running this country for a very long time. There are senior traditional leaders who have been deposed from their positions. Some were jailed fighting for their land. Some were deported to some other places because they were supporting ANC then. Now, for an ANC leader to come out and say traditional leaders cannot administer land, it's an insult to all the kings and queens in the country.
Traditional leader says land expropriation is about giving dignity and equality to rural people. They say that expropriation of land is moving at a slow pace. Dumela Matshogo, SABC News, Bushbuckridge.
The Pan-Africanist Congress says it is the only party that can deliver on the land issue. The party believes it will regain its former glory as it is the original champion for land expropriation. The PAC national organizer Mbuyiselo Kantsu says the party is now united under one leadership. He was addressing the PAC members at the Provincial Consultative Conference in Bloemfontein.
We are happy that as the PAC we are united, and that is why we are here today. As we are talking today is that also other people are on the ground with the campaign whilst we are still going on with our programs here. So we are definitely sure that the PAC is going to perform well in this province, far more than what people are expecting.
Land in South Africa. In fact, let me say land in Africa. So the scramble for Africa, the Congo conference, everything leads back to it. And it will also be disingenuous when we talk about land and we don't talk about how the ANC betrayed their own mandate against land. I don't want to talk more. I just want maybe to combine an hour-long different narratives of people talking about the land, how land is important to South Africans. My channel is a Pan-Africanist channel, so what I want to do is I always want to project things from an African perspective. And I don't want to be accused of forgetting why there has been a struggle. The ANC went in struggle because of land. You talk about, most of the things that I'm telling you is I've spoken about in the past in the podcast, but I think sometimes we tend to lose our head. We've got 66%. It is just a decision, an ego between African parties to say, we want land, you want land, you want land. Let's forget everything and do land. Why is it not happening? Listen to the video. Listen to the complexities. Listen to the people. You know, people are talking about we don't have CODESA minutes. The land is what keeps people from reaching whatever they want. And I ordinarily want to speak after these long videos, but I want to tell you what I feel about land. What I feel about land is that there is land that is in the hands of Africans. This narrative of saying all the land is in the hands of white people, they're denying. It's actually disingenuous. There is land that is in tribal hands. There is land that is in municipalities led by African people. There is land in the hands of provinces that are led by African people. But Africans who can give this land to African people, they do not want to give land. There's no white person in between that decision and acquiring of that land, but they would not want to do it because they want to shield themselves after land. But of course, we are not absolving white people from this conquest, because it is a conquest. But I don't want to speak much, please listen to the narratives of land. In another podcast, I'll come and talk about this. Thank you. Machine Political Incorrect. Of course, at the end, tell us what you think about this and give us advice to correct our politics from being incorrect to the correct ones. Thank you.
The story of the Mala Mala Game Reserve land claim is almost the perfect case study of all of the issues that have plagued the South African land restitution process over the last 3 decades, including the use of communal property associations, the willing buyer, willing seller policy, and alleged government corruption. Mala Mala, a land claim that was settled for 1.1 billion rand in 2013, is the biggest payout to a single landowner in South African history. To put it in context, the year before Mala Mala was paid out, national government had reportedly spent a total of 1.2 billion rand settling 36,000 separate urban land claims. According to reports, Mala Mala all but exhausted the national budget for land claims in the year that it was paid out. This payout was reportedly about 200 million rand more than the original asking price of the owner, who still reportedly got to keep a 70% stake in running the business. Let's start with some background. Mala Mala was founded in 1962 by Michael and Norma Rattray. The couple is credited with pioneering the idea of ecotourism, especially luxury ecotourism, where tourists pay to see, photograph, and learn more about the animals rather than hunting them. Mala Mala and its neighbors Sabi Sabi, Singita, and Londolozi are all part of the private Sabi Sands Game Reserve and are known as some of the most expensive game lodges in the world. Court documents submitted to the Land Claims Court reportedly state that the local community living on that land was forcibly removed between the 1920s and the 1970s. They were reportedly resettled in 11 villages surrounding the game reserves in the nearby Bushbuck Ridge district. Spoke Sithole, who was a 100-year-old living claimant back in 2018, told the Mail and Guardian that his family was kicked off of their land by, quote, white men with guns. They just came and said the government had given them the land. They said the land belongs to the government. It does not belong to us. And we were required to leave the place because they want to start a business, a game reserve. We followed the orders as we were told. Those who were left behind, they were used as slaves. Sithole also reportedly told the newspaper that his family and community members were not allowed to take their cattle with them. Quote, some of them were left behind and eaten by the wild animals. There was nothing that could be done. We did not have the means to fight, he said. When the land claim process opened, there were reportedly multiple land claims on the 21 farms that make up the Sabi Sands Game Reserve. Mala Mala was made up of about 8 or 9 of those farms, and there were reportedly about 2,000 claimants for that land. So instead of dealing with multiple land claims for multiple farms with multiple owners, and in an effort to make the process more streamlined and winnable, the department decided to combine all of the land claims into one single land claim against one single owner, Michael Rattray of Mala Mala. It said that in 2008, when the department approached Rattray to make an offer to buy the game reserve, he put down an initial asking price of about 750 million rand, which the department deemed as too expensive and withdrew their offer. Reportedly, when the deal was put back on the table in 2011, Rattray's asking price had gone up to 900 million rand, to which the government counter-offered 360 million rand. Both the Land Claims Court and the High Court reportedly deemed the Rattray's asking price as excessive, and the land claimants lodged an appeal with the Constitutional Court. They argued that the landowners had already benefited unfairly from race-based land policies and had already made a significant income from the property. Both the Land Claims Court and the Department of Land Reform reportedly feared that settling such a large claim would set a bad precedent for other landowners to name asking prices that would basically bankrupt them. The willing buyer, willing seller policy, which basically dictates that landowners have the right to be compensated at market price when their land is redistributed, has been criticized by many as one of the reasons for the failure of land reform in South Africa. Though the departments largely followed that policy, the Constitutional Court, on the other hand, did not require for the state to pay market prices for land, instead advising that compensation should be just and equitable and strike a fair balance between the public interest and the interests of those affected. And so if the Mala Mala case had been heard by the Constitutional Court, it had the potential to be precedent-setting in terms of how compensation would be handled going forward. But before the case could be heard by the Constitutional Court, the department overseeing land reform announced an out-of-court settlement with the owners of Mala Mala for 1.1 billion rand.
All of us must come together and say, enough is enough. Our people must get the land. We've offered the ANC our 6% to amend the Constitution, and that 6% still stands to the African National Congress.
The ANC unequivocally supports the principle of land expropriation without compensation as moved by the EFF. Honorable Speaker, we may disagree on the modalities, but the principle we agree. There's no question about that.
Black people were brutally dispossessed and forcibly removed from their land. Decades later, the wounds still run deep. There is an indisputable need to right that wrong, to make amends. My fellow countrymen, Sizwe Sakuti, expropriation without compensation cannot be part of the solution.
Honorable Malema, when she says that there should be no compensation, expropriation without compensation, maybe she's correct. Because these people that stole the land from the Khoi and the San in District 6 and everywhere, they all became millionaires at the expense of the blood, sweat, and tears of these people. So in any event, there should be no compensation whatsoever. So we must expropriate. The ANC, the National Freedom Party, the EFF, and the IFP are all in agreement we must expropriate. So what is the delay? There's no need for a debate. Let's go forward. Let's go out there and expropriate.
I thoroughly agree with the Honourable Nkwinti when he said, and to use his words, that the narrative that the land was stolen must stop because it's false. I agree. If we want to debate on a responsible manner about land, we will have to stop that.
Those of us who yesterday were harassed by our white counterparts now confront a challenge I think some of us are ashamed to accept. The danger that there are those who think that equality in our time means that we must dominate whites.
It would be like boiling a frog alive, which is done by raising the temperature very slowly. Being cold-blooded, the frog does not notice the temperature increase, but if the temperature is raised suddenly, the frog will jump out of the water. These are the words of South Africa's President, Cyril Ramaphosa. He meant that the black majority would pass laws transferring wealth, land, and economic power from white to black, slowly and incrementally, until the whites lost all they have gained in South Africa, but without taking too much from them at any given time to cause them to rebel or fight.
All land in South Africa, all of it, belongs to us, and all of it was stolen from us. And when I say us, I'm talking about black people in this country.
The taking of land from the indigenous people of this country was the original sin.
The Zulu kingdom must never allow white people to put it against the black majority. No one is going to take land from Zulu people. These are white people who are still owning our land. It is only through the expropriation of land without compensation that our people will be the rightful owners of this country.
The South African Parliament has voted in favour of new legislation that could see land seized from white farmers. Under the plans, white farmers would be stripped of their land with no compensation, although this does run against the Constitution, which would have to be amended.
White people arrived here from Europe in 1652. They killed our people, they stole our land, they oppressed us. All the land they have is land that was taken from us by force and in many instances by massacres.
We all visitors to South Africa, including the black tribes of South Africa that came from the north. That is well documented.
We don't back whites. We don't care about their feelings. They must be happy. We are not beating them up. They must be happy. We are not calling for genocide.
Almost 400 years ago, a criminal by the name of Jan van Riebeeck landed in our native land.
It's a fact that land must be returned back to those who are landless.
We don't know what peace looks like. They've been living peacefully. They've been swimming in a pool of privilege. They've been enjoying themselves because they always owned our land.
When Jan van Riebeeck landed in the Western Cape, our problems began.
The return of the land to the people from whom it was taken speaks to precisely what we need to do to heal the divisions of the past.
We are not calling for the slaughtering of white people, at least for now.
It is clear that the South African government's push for expropriation without compensation is founded in a racist sentiment and a distortion of history. While the primary targets of this policy are clearly white farmers, the primary victims might just as well be all the people of South Africa.
Guess what? They took on the Ingonyama Trust and they won, but now residents, of course, coming from the Jozini, rural Jozini, that is in KwaZulu-Natal's far north, say that they need, to feel more vindicated, and they do at this point, of course, with the outcome of the case. But a ruling by the Pietermaritzburg High Court declared the trust, of course, was acted unlawfully and in violation of the Constitution, this by concluding that residential leases with people who are in fact the true owners of the land in terms of the Zulu customary law, but now the Ingonyama Trust has to pay back some of that money back. Let's just hear from ENC's senior reporter, Pamandla Goge, who followed through with the story.
It was a case of David versus Goliath. These residents from rural Ejozini took on one of the most powerful institutions in the Zulu kingdom, and they came out on top.
Amalungelo ethu nje athe ngasekho nomuzi nje mawubheka besingasenawo ntatheli umuzi nje lo bese ngoweNgonyama Trust uba mangihlule ukukhokha bezofika angikhiphe ngiphume ngegate avala amagate adayisa umuzi le mali yakhe sengiyikweneta.
Despite signing lease agreements with Ingonyama Trust, some say they couldn't start paying due to financial difficulties.
Installment isambe sithi 2067 rand. Angaze ngikhokhe lutho ngoba bengingenayo leyo mali leyo. Usukela nje ngo2012 kuze kube manje vele bekusinda ikhanda kumina ukuthi leyo mali ngizoyithathaphi. Ngoba lokho okuncane engikutholayo kufanele ngithengele ingane ukudla.
Others say more people have been scammed by Ingonyama Trust and are scared to come forward, fearing victimization.
Ngiyajabula kakhulu mina ukuthi into iqale encane abantu bengayinaki. Ngenxa yokushodolwazi abantu abaningi yabantu mangake uye kuHamasteli uye kobaba nangu uye endaweni eziningi ukukhuluma ngonyama Trust mhlambe ukhamba ukuthi bangagwaza ngomkhonto babona nomkhonto mhlambe bakugwaza ngoba bahlukumezekile abantu bahlunyezwe ngonyama wemfowethu ungazomuntu okutshela manga.
The court judgments also been scathing on the land reform minister's failure to exercise oversight over the trust.
The judgment of the court must be implemented as soon as is possible. Therefore, the court was correct in actually saying the minister has the responsibility to ensure that tenure security of rural communities are protected. And in that instance, we accept what the court has said, that we failed in our responsibility to ensure that that delegation has been done in accordance with the Land Affairs Act, which actually still allows the permission to occupy to be given until there is a new law that deals with communal land tenure.
2 NGOs, the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, and the Legal Resource Center assisted the applicants.
It's a far-reaching judgment that affirms the customary law rights that people enjoy over land in South Africa and says to the state that they have a responsibility in terms of the Constitution to ensure that those customary rights are formalized and adequately protected so that they cannot be diluted in any way, as was done in this particular case by the Ingonyama Trust seeking to convert customary rights to land to 40-year leases. So this is a very important judgment that will affect many millions of people across the country.
There's not an attack on the terms of the on which the trust and its board actually manages the land. It was a specific aspect because the hardship that it caused went to the heart of the kinds of clients and communities that we represent. This was about taking forward the steps to protect the rights of very vulnerable groups.
ENCA has tried since the ruling to get comment from Ingonyama Trust, but to no avail. Siphamandla Koke, eJozini, KwaZulu-Natal.
Want a serious discussion about land reform, we should probably get out of the denialism of black pain and the denialism of black dispossession, and recognize that the constitutional framework was itself intended as an instrument for the liberation of African people over a colonial process. So I don't see the Constitution in the same way as many people who debate about the Constitution as protecting or restraining the capacity of the state from facilitating socioeconomic transformation. To the contrary, I see the Constitution as an instrument for socioeconomic transformation. So the big part of this discussion should be how we reconsider the constitutional state and how we put at the center of the constitutional state the project of transformation. But nevertheless, and contrary to some of the sort of more radical speakers on this topic, nevertheless, I am still an adherent to a constitutional solution to the land reform project. So when we talk about Section 25 of the Constitution, a lot of people refer to Section 25 as a property clause. But you might as well look at Section 25 as an anti-property clause. It's the clause that entitles the state to interfere in property relations, in individual rights to property for the larger benefit of the South African state. So it is in part, and this is, again, maybe still more convincing, in part why you should buy my book if you've got the money, so that you can understand the context, so that you can be, what do the Twitter people call it, woke or something. All right. But I think today's discussion is a much more focused one on the current context and not on the historical context, right? And the current context also has some kind of history. It's got some background. 27 April 1994, we adopt an interim constitution. It contains provisions around property. That is then replaced in February 1996 by the final constitution, which contains Section 25. Section 25 is a long subsection with 9 subsections, right? It opens with no one may be deprived of property and no law may allow arbitrary deprivations of property. This is a very important opening to Section 25 because it illustrates the point that this is not a property clause, this is an anti-property clause. How that clause came to be framed the way it was is because there was a contest. The ANC negotiators went into CODESA and the subsequent Constitutional Assembly with their negotiating position, largely containing all of the clauses that we see in Section 25. On the other hand, the National Party and parties like the DP, I saw the DA the other day saying, "Viva Section 25." The truth is that they actually opposed Section 25 during the negotiations. And the reason they opposed Section 25 was because they wanted to entrench an unqualified right to private property. That was fought, and ultimately it was resolved at the Constitutional Court because there was a provision in the principles of constitution making that the Constitution would have to be certified by the Constitutional Court. One of the most contentious clauses was Section 25. The proposal by the ANC, which is an anti-property clause, and the proposal by the National Party, the DP, Inkatha Freedom Party, and all of these other similarly minded parties. I'm sorry if they are DA people, and I'm saying they're similarly minded to the IFP. At the time, they were on the property clause. These days, there's a bit of radicalism emerging there. But the point is that this debate was ultimately resolved in a 1997 judgment by the Constitutional Court, which endorsed the anti-property provisions. In other words, endorsed Section 25(1). No one may be deprived of property except in terms of a law of general application, and no law may permit arbitrary deprivations of property. So our conception of Section 25 first needs to align with the fundamental premise of the section, that we don't have a property clause. We don't have a private property clause. What we have is an anti-property clause that enables the state to interfere in private property in order to redress the historical wrongs. So that is the point of departure in understanding Section 25. But unlike other constitutional property provisions in comparable countries, our Section 25 then contains 8 subclauses. What do those subclauses do? They do primarily 3 things. The first is that they give the state the power of expropriation. So the state in this country is constitutionally empowered to expropriate private property. In other words, to forcibly take private property. But that power of expropriation is constrained. Internally constrained first, because the land or property, because it's broader than land, can only be expropriated for public purposes and in the public interest. And those two concepts are crucial because public purposes and public interest are not the same. Public interest incorporates land reform. In other words, under the Constitution, the state is entitled to expropriate land for a broader redistribution program, right? So they have the power. They've had the power since 1994, but it is a power they have not used. The second thing that happens in Section 25 is that when they exercise the power of expropriation, they must pay compensation in accordance with a formula called just and equitable formula. And although they have that power, what they have done over the past 23 years, they have not actually exercised the just and equitable payment formula. What they have done instead is to rely on a market-determined dispensation, the so-called willing seller, willing buyer. They again have no constitutional obligations. In fact, their obligation is contrary to what they have been doing. But I read something somewhere that Ruth Hall says that the market
took place yesterday where the EFF and the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, Contralesa, held a joint press conference in which they agreed that Section 25 of the Constitution must be changed. And it follows a meeting between the two parties where they are reported to have ironed out their differences on the role of traditional leaders on the issue of land expropriation without compensation. So to discuss this further with us this morning, we now join by Contralesa's General Secretary, Zolani Mkiva. Thanks so much for coming in.
The pleasure is all mine. Good morning, and good morning to the viewers.
So let's start here. Please explain to us Contralesa's role and also their view on expropriation of land without compensation.
Contralesa supports the expropriation of land without compensation, and this is our old held view. We are saying that we should do it like that simply because the majority of land in South Africa is in the hands of private hands as well as foreign hands. And we think that our freedom is incomplete without the reclamation and restoration of the land to the African majority. We went to struggle precisely for that reason, to restore land back to the people that it belongs to. So it's not a new thing, and we believe that expropriation without compensation is the best mechanism, because the last 24 years have seen the willing buyer, willing seller thing. It's not working. If we were to continue in any other way other than expropriating without compensation, this issue will take more than 500 years. We want to see the restoration of land to the African majority happening in our lifetime as soon as possible. We don't see anything difficult with it. If the Constitution is not having the right teeth to do that, therefore let's amend the Constitution. Hence we say that Section 25 needs to be amended to allow the Constitution to be able to have effectiveness to do what we want to see happening within the framework of the law.
So what is interesting at this stage is that the EFF and the ANC seem to be in agreement on this particular matter. So it was rather curious that Contralesa came out in this press conference with the economic freedom fighters, when we know that traditionally Contralesa backed the ANC when it came to matters of election. I remember before the 2016 election, Contralesa was actually, coming out saying to the ANC, well, you only use us as voting fodder when the time comes to vote. So what has changed in that regard?
Well, look, politics are dynamic, much as culture is dynamic in society. And therefore, the National Executive Committee of Contralesa took a decision to engage all the progressive formations in South Africa, political parties, trade unions, and the civil society at large. So in that context, we met with the EFF on the 11th of June so that we can present our case to all of them and to indicate to them what we stand for as the institution of traditional leadership, in order to be able to do away with the perceptions that they might have about what we represent. In that context, we found each other, and they got to understand where we come from. Remember that it was traditional leaders who were at the forefront of the wars of resistance and wars of dispossession. So we were quite very eager to meet the EFF in particular, because the EFF is a new political party which has brought vibrancy in the politics of the country. You see what they are doing in Parliament. They are raising topical issues very sharply. And we thought that as Contralesa, it's important that we interface with them, because they were also very vocal on the land question. And the land question has since moved quite very fast. But it doesn't mean that we are cutting ties with the ANC. Contralesa is born in the womb of the liberation struggle, long before the EFF was in place. But the reality of the situation is that the EFF is in existence, and it is a serious player in the politics of South Africa. It's youthful, it's zealous, and we acknowledge their role in society. However, we are engaging the ANC. On Monday, the 2nd of July, we met with the national officials of the ANC to talk about the very same matters. And you are correct to say the ANC and the EFF supports expropriation of land without compensation. In its 54th conference at Nazareth last year, December, the ANC resolved unanimously in that conference that they support this. And we think that it is going to go through this amendment of the Constitution, because it's supported by both the ruling party and the EFF. And surely there's going to be more than 2/3 majority for this thing to happen. And Contralesa has to step up, because there's also an issue of communal land. And this whole debate has been defocused. And there were some politicians who also implied that the 13%, which is the few pockets of land under the hands of the African majority, is also to be expropriated. And we needed to ensure that that is not about to happen, and it will never happen. So the focus will be on 87%, which is stolen land, which is land that was taken against the African majority in a criminal and a brutal way.
And we'll come back to talk more.
It is a very full topic to have a discussion around. There's a lot of components. There's naturally political, like it's a political minefield to begin with. There's a lot of legislation. There's been constant legislation that's been brought out through the years. So, I mean, if we look at history of land disposition, I mean, this goes back centuries, up into the point of land reform, which is current policy and new legislation that's coming out, and different political views and opinions on how it's going to be implemented. So impacting on current land ownership it is what it is. I mean, our land ownership system is based on registration with the deeds registry. So if we look at it from a systematic point of view, where there's title deeds, there's ownership. Where title deeds still vest in the government, which is generally land that doesn't belong to any individual, would be land that the government owns, would belong to them. Are we speaking about now land reform? That's difficult, because yes, there's complaints that title deeds aren't being passed along when they should be, or that government should give away the land, but that's obviously a very intense, full conversation. So the short answer to the question is, can I give you history? Not in a short period of time, and not that I even have all that history. It's just that complex. How does it impact current land ownership? How did land dispossession in the past impact current land ownership? Again, that is a political view. It's, are people owners of lands they should be? Well, that's why you have the Land Claims Court and all these reform regulations and legislation. So sorry, Cindy, I hope that feeds the answer a little bit.
I'm Dima Katamotau. Author and political activist Professor Raymond Satna is in the studio to talk to us about the reasons behind the formation of the ANC. Raymond, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Why was the ANC formed, and what did it aim to achieve?
I think the ANC must be understood, or it was called the South African Native National Congress when it was formed in 1912. We must understand it against the history of South Africa, with the conquest of all independent African peoples, which started from the first settlement in 1652, but was particularly strong in the 19th century, with 100 years of warfare in the Eastern Cape, battles in Sekhukhune, what is now Sekhukhune land, against the Zulu in Isandlwana, against the Sotho, against the Venda under the grandfather of Mpepu, who was a Bantustan leader. His grandfather had led resistance. So there's a whole lot of forms of resistance that were defeated. Secondly, there was a missionary influence, which I think gave whatever the negative aspects of Christianity may have been in the eyes of some people. Christianity gave people a sense of all people being humans, all people being part of God's creation. And consequently, this was also a motivating factor which drew people into an emancipatory idea, an idea that they didn't have to be the dogs of the white person. In the late 1880s, a number of political organizations and educational and journalistic organizations were formed, and these were the prelude to the ANC. But the main things that really got people worried were the end of the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, the Treaty of Vereniging, where all the previous colonies were given self-government, that is, rights over black people. This was really a prelude to union, where the British handed power over the whole of South Africa to the whites. And this is the reason why the SANNC was formed.
People sometimes suggest that the early ANC went cap in hand to beg for concessions. Some people also suggest that they mimicked their masters by wearing top hats and similar formal clothing. Generally, there is a tendency to ridicule them. What is your view on this?
It's very easy to say they were obsequious, look at the way they dressed. But we have to understand that one period of struggle was over, what one poet called the time of the spear. And they had to operate on a terrain where the conventions required that they should dress in a particular way. And there's an art critic, John Berger, who claims that the suit was invented as the attire of the ruling class in Britain. So in a sense, when you wear the attire of your ruler, you may be interpreted as making a claim, which they were, to being equal subjects under the crown. So I think some of their protestations, the way they did it, must be understood as adapting, but even making a claim.
Was it not necessary for the ANC Youth League to be forced to wake them up and make the organization effective?
You see, very often people think that history operates with some people moving very slowly and then suddenly there is a rupture. Now, I understand history as operating with continuities and with ruptures. In the whole history of the ANC, there were some people who didn't go wearing suits and things like this. In the 1920s, there was the Industrial and Commercial Union, which quickly got 100,000 members, and they spread like a wildfire in the rural areas. So it was possible to have mass struggle. But we cannot say that it was undesirable for people to send deputations to Britain, to have petitions. The question in politics is, when has something run its course? And I think the leaders of the ANC were not ready to abandon what they had been doing when it had really been shown to be fruitless. And before the Youth League, they started to rebuild the ANC from about the mid-30s. Reverend Khalata went on a union-wide tour to see the state of the organization. It took him 3 years to complete. Now this gives one an idea of the conditions under which they worked. And when Dr. Xuma became ANC president, he and Khalata built branches. Now without these structures, the ANC Youth League would not have been able to implement their ideas. Those radical ideas which transformed the ANC required structures. Also, Dr. Xuma, long before the ANC was a non-racial organization, he had a pact with the Indian Congresses between himself and Dr. Naika, Dr. Naika of the Indian Congress and Dr. Dadu. It's known as the Doctors' Pact in 1949, and they agreed to cooperate. So you had this, at that stage, the Youth League was not prepared to work with non-Africans and communists. So that while the Youth League, I think the importance of the Youth League must not be underestimated. You have Anton Lembede, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, A.P.M. Dar, Nelson Mandela, declaring for the first time South Africa is a black man's country. And I think that was part of a revolutionary discourse and was very important for the development of South Africa. But I think we must see them as building on what went before. Even the earliest ANC deputations had an element of subversion, because what they were saying is, Your Majesty, help us. And when they say help us, they're actually undermining the union government. Moroka and Sisulu wrote letters to the Prime Minister informing them in 1952 that if they didn't repeal certain laws by a certain date, they would embark on defiance of these.
Why is this such a contentious issue? Well, Tessa, the background to this is that back in the apartheid era, in fact, dating back from more than a century ago, many black people were dispossessed of their land. And yet 25 years after the end of apartheid, much of the land remains, especially the best quality land, remains in the hands of white people. After 1994, the ANC brought in a voluntary scheme known as willing seller, willing buyer. The idea was the government would buy up land to redistribute to black people. And yet there's been incredibly slow progress on this. The target was for something like 30% of that land to be redistributed. Only around 10% actually has. Land and agriculture are very important in South Africa, and the economy has been performing extremely poorly. Unemployment is extremely high, 27% according to the latest figures. President Ramaphosa went on TV last night saying this move now to change the constitution, which has been mooted for some time, this is what they want to do, and particularly this measure to allow land to be expropriated without compensation. That's the highly contentious issue. That's the measure that's seen as targeting white farmers in particular.
All right, so what could this lead to? I mean, could there be a lot more reaction to this?
It has been very contentious. Of course, it conjures up images of a Zimbabwe-type situation where we saw in years past white farmers being forced from their land. The government says it's not about land grabbing. There's a certain amount of optimism, despite increasing conflicts over this. There's a certain amount of optimism amongst farmers and amongst business that this can work, that land has been transferred successfully. There's a lot of criticism saying that it may be counterproductive, and you may actually see black people being forced off their land because they have actually been acquiring land. The government says it's going to push ahead with it. There's this big stimulus package for the economy as well. It won't necessarily get through Parliament, though. And a lot depends on the reaction in the coming days, particularly from South Africa's international investors.
Land and who owns it? It's a defining question in South Africa. It began with the conquest of the land more than 4 centuries ago, and ever since, land and race have been inextricably linked.
We need our land back. That's it. And they are going to grab it by force.
Now, an ANC government is promising it'll give land to landless blacks by taking it from white farmers.
The Constitution, as it stands, does not impede expropriation of land without compensation.
Ramaphosa is under pressure to take action. It's estimated only 10% of commercial farmland has been redistributed, compared to the 30% promised by Mandela back in 1994. And the budget for land reform is just 0.4% of the national total. But to understand the passions raised, you have to go back into history. Overcrowded and impoverished. And they weren't allowed to purchase or hire land in white areas. Over the decades, blacks were gradually forced into ever smaller portions of land. 72% of the land would end up in the hands of just 9% of the population.
I'm suffering. I won't be the same like white people. I'm suffering because I'm black.
There's Mr. Mandela, a free man taking his first step.
With the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, there was hope for freedom, jobs, and land.
Amandla! E-Afrika!
But change provoked a violent backlash among some Afrikaners, who joined an extremist militia, vowing civil war to keep the land and swearing they'd never live under black rule.
With policemen and demonstrators shot and Ventersdorp in a virtual state of siege, President de Klerk must now be wondering whether he made the right decision in coming here to the citadel of the white right wing.
Civil war didn't happen. Compromise prevailed. A new order came into being.
Each time one of us touches the soil of this land, we feel a sense of personal renewal.
25 years on, there's a crisis over who owns that soil. With an election looming, the ANC is threatened by more radical groups like the Economic Freedom Fighters.
We must be prepared for everything. It's a war.
After years in which they allowed the land issue to drift, the ANC is promising to end the willing buyer, willing seller system and take land without compensation. All of this summoned up memories of the chaotic land invasions in Zimbabwe.
The violent nature of Zimbabwe's land reform program is undeniable.
Here in South Africa, the government faces a perilous balancing act. Because if they take too much land, it runs the risk of scaring away international investors needed to revive the economy. Too little, and you betray the promise of freedom. But Cyril Ramaphosa is a pragmatist. He's appointed a team of experts from across the racial divide to advise him on land reform. Compromise will be essential. His task is huge.